Hello fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today we are going to cover the second story in Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow. And this story is called The Mask. And like the first story, this story starts with a quote from the imaginary play The King in Yellow. Camilla says, "You, sir, should unmask." And the stranger says, "Indeed." Casilda, "Indeed, it's time. We all have laid aside disguise but you." And the stranger says, "I wear no mask." And Camilla, terrified, aside to Casilda, says, "No mask, no mask." That is from The King in Yellow, Act 1, Scene 2D. This story has an altogether different atmosphere to the first story, and it's one that I really enjoyed, but not for the same reasons that I enjoyed the first one, and we'll get into that as we go along. But for now, let's just jump right into our deep dive. If you want more information about Robert Chambers and the publication of this book, go back and watch the first video, which deals with the first story in this book. Of course, this is a plot-spoiling deep read. I'm going to go through the whole story as we discuss it. Okay, so this story is about four artists that live kind of a bohemian lifestyle in Paris. I think Alec and Jack Scott are both from America, and Genevieve might be as well. And then Boris had English and Russian parentage, so speaks English. So they bring him in as one of the group. So it's these four artists. So Alec is a painter, Jack Scott is also a painter, Boris is a sculptor. We never find out what Genevieve does. So the quote from the play, of course, reminds us of Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of Red Death. When they take off his disguise, there's nothing underneath. Okay, I think that's all I needed to say to set up the story. So this story opens with Alec and Boris in Boris's studio, and he is showing him a new liquid chemical that he's discovered. And he demonstrates what this liquid does by dropping a freshly picked lily into this liquid. And the liquid turns the lily into stone. And there's a flash of light at the base, as if the sunlight was hitting the base of this clear tub that he put the lily in. And Boris reaches in and takes out the rose and says, "You can only take it out when that flash of light is seen." This is an incredible beginning to this story. I really loved the idea of this sculptor. Boris is a sculptor slash chemist who has discovered a chemical that will turn anything into stone. Such a unique idea. And right after this, we learn that it's Boris. We learn that Boris and Genevieve are lovers, and that they live together, and that Alec and Jack Scott are always hanging around the house. They're kind of a group, a circle that hang together all the time. And Boris, the year before, had sculpted the Madonna and the Fates, these two different sculptures, and the Madonna has made him very famous, and it was the most important sculpture in the salon that year. And now he's working on another one that he doesn't feel too good about, but he's discovered this chemical that allows you to drop life into it, and it comes out perfectly sculpted as if in stone. And of course, I expected the story to run from this point to him using the liquid to make the most perfect sculptures ever. But I'm glad to report that first idea, which is the one that kind of pops into your head when you hear about this, is not the one that he ran with, and I'm glad of that. Instead, right away, Boris says, I'm never going to release this to the public. I'm never going to tell anybody about it." And Alec brings up the lily and said, "When you destroyed the lily," and Boris said, "Did I destroy it or did I preserve it?" and they talk about the implications of this on art, and they compare it specifically, and this is something that I found very interesting because it's something we don't think about very often. He compares it to photography and the way that photography hurt painters. And he says this chemical will do the same thing to sculptors that photography did to painters. Later, I think it's another day, Alec and Boris are fooling around, and he's fooling around as if to throw Alec in the pool, and he suddenly stops and says, "Oh my God, I forgot I filled the pool with the chemical." And Alec says, "Please remember that kind of stuff when we're roughhousing." So later again, Alec is left alone with Genevieve, but Genevieve doesn't realize he's there, and he takes a nap in this specific room, and he wakes up and sees somebody coming for him and calls out Genevieve's name, and she falls to the floor, and he goes over to see her, and it turns out that she tripped on the wolf head that's part of this rug that they have and sprained her ankle. And that everybody's gone, but that he should kind of help her get to I think, no, she has a maid help her, and she says, "You go ahead and go home. We've kept you too long." So he goes home, and that night Genevieve gets a fever, and they don't know really what's making her sick, and the doctor doesn't quite understand it. And she, at one point, says to Boris that, and she's kind of in a delirium, she says to Boris that the fever's coming from her broken heart, which she doesn't really understand. And then she rests, which she needs to do for her fever, and Boris and Jack and Alec turn a goldfish into stone, trying to keep Boris's mind off of Genevieve. And then Jack Scott says, "We got to turn a rabbit into stone." And this is a little too much for Alec to take. He can't stay and watch the process of the rabbit turning to stone, so he walks away. While they're doing that, he goes into the library and pulls down any book that his hand comes into contact with, and he pulls out The King in Yellow. "Alas, I had found The King in Yellow. After a few moments, which seemed ages, I was putting it away with a nervous shudder, when Boris and Jack came in bringing their marble rabbit." And this will be important later. He pulls it down, and with a nervous shudder that seems to take ages, he puts it back up. And the question of if he read The King in Yellow or not will become important to our discussion later, because I think that, unlike the first story, Robert W. Chambers isn't making it purposely clear that he read The King in Yellow, although later we will see that he recognizes parts of the play, so we'll see. Later that evening, Genevieve awakes, and they run up. They send Jack Scott to get somebody, and then Boris and Alec run up to see her, and she apparently spills the contents of her heart and says Alec's name, and it's very vague and kind of difficult to understand what happened here. My guess is that she admitted to loving both of these men. So I'm going to read this section, and that way you can kind of get your own take from it. "At my first touch, she sighed and sank back, closing her eyes, and then, as we still bent above her, she opened them again, looked straight into Boris's face, poor fever-crazed girl, and told her secret. At the same instant, our 3 lives turned into new channels. The bond that had held us so long together snapped forever, and a new bond was forged in its place. For she had spoken my name, and as the fever tortured her, her heart poured out its load of hidden sorrow. Amazed and dumb, I bowed my head, while my face burned like a live coal, and the blood surged in my ears, stupefying me with its clamor. Incapable of movement, incapable of speech. I listened to her feverish words in an agony of shame and sorrow. I could not silence her. I could not look at Boris. Then I felt an arm upon my shoulder, and Boris turned a bloodless face to mine. "It is not your fault, Alec. Don't grieve so if she loves you." But he could not finish. And as the doctors stepped swiftly into the room saying, "Ah, the fever," I seized Jack Scott and hurried him to the street saying, "Boris would rather be alone." We crossed the street to our own apartments, and that night, seeing I was going to be ill too, he went for the doctor again. The last thing I recollect with any distinctness was hearing Jack say, "For heaven's sake, doctor, what ails him to wear a face like that?" And I thought of the King in Yellow and the Pallid Mask. So here we see that he knows the quote of the Pallid Mask, and that he's familiar with the quote that was right at the beginning, where the King in Yellow is, or the stranger is not wearing any mask. And while he is in the fever, which lasts for 2 years, he's in this fever for 2 years. And while he's in this fever, he considers the concept that his love for Genevieve is like a mask. And at night he thinks things that he considers treacherous to Boris and unfair to Genevieve. But when he's alone, the mask can flip up and he can be who he truly is. And then during the day, the mask snaps back down and he's unable to lift it back up. This reminded me of T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is a poem that I absolutely love and love talking about with my students. And there's a line in there: "There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet." And I really loved that line, because couched in that one line is this entire concept of the fact that we are often performative when we are in social situations, and that we can only truly be ourselves when we are alone. And I feel like that's what Robert W. Chambers is getting at here, is that he can only allow his love for Genevieve out in the night when he is alone and nobody else is around, and then the day the mask comes back on. So while he's using the King in Yellow as a metaphor for this mask, I feel like the King in Yellow aspect of it kind of pales to the mask doing the work of talking about his love for Genevieve, if that makes sense. And I'll get into this more as we continue through the story. But also, while he is in this stupor, he thinks more about the King in Yellow. And this is the only other quote that really covers the King in Yellow in this story. "The mask of self-deception was no longer a mask for me. It was a part of me. Night lifted it, laying bare the stifled truth below. But there was no one to see except myself, and when day broke, the mask fell back again of its own accord. These thoughts passed through my troubled mind as I lay sick, but they were hopelessly entangled with visions of white creatures, heavy as stone, crawling about in Boris's basin, of the wolf's head on the rug, foaming and snapping at Genevieve, who lay smiling beside it. I thought, too, of the King in Yellow, wrapped in the fantastic colors of his tattered mantle, and that bitter cry of Casilda, 'Not upon us, O King, not upon us.' Feverishly I struggled to put it down from me, but I saw the Lake of Hali, thin and blank, without a ripple or wind to stir it, and I saw the towers of Carcosa behind the moon. Aldebaran, the Hyades, Altar, Hastur, glided through the cloud rifts, which fluttered and flapped as they passed like the scalloped tatters of the King in Yellow. Among all these, one same thought persisted. It never wavered, no matter what else was going on in my disordered mind, that my chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement of Boris and Genevieve. What this obligation was, its nature was never clear. Sometimes it seemed to be protection, sometimes support through a great crisis. Whatever it seemed to be for the time, its weight rested only on me, and I was never so ill or so weak that I did not respond with my whole soul. There were always crowds of faces about me, mostly strange, but a few I recognized, Boris among them. Afterward they told me that this could not have been, but I knew that once, at least, he bent over me. It was only a touch, a faint echo of his voice. Then the clouds settled back on my senses, and I lost him. But he did stand there and bend over me at least once. So when Alec finally wakes up from this 2-year-long fever, the first thing he does is ask for Boris, and Jack Scott's there taking care of him, and he avoids the question, but eventually Jack has to tell him that both Boris and Genevieve have died, and this sends him back into a fever that lasts another few months. He relapses, and when he finally comes to, Jack is able to tell him the story. So Genevieve was recovering from her sickness, but was still feeling some of its effects, and she was drugged in bed, getting rest that she needed, and Boris was in his studio that had the pool that he had filled with the liquid, and suddenly Genevieve runs in and throws herself into the liquid pool, and Boris is so devastated by this that he takes his own life. And this, of course, is awful for Alec and Scott to realize. And it turns out Boris has left the certain aspects of his life to Scott, but the house and the statues or the sculptures he's left to Alec. But Alec, I think he goes there once, can't bear to stay, and leaves and goes east and travels for another 2 years. Eventually, Jack asks him to come back, and he does, and he actually moves into Boris and Genevieve's old house, which is now his house. And he lives there for months, and he can't bear the concept of going into the sculpture room. He just can't do it. And then after a couple of months, he finally brings himself to do it. And he opens the doors, and Genevieve is set underneath the Madonna sculpture that was sculpted in her image. And I think they're facing each other. He calls it a loop. It's really interesting, this idea of the sculpture that was inspired by her and then the sculpture that was chemically created around her that is her. It's a really interesting image. I really enjoy it. I think he kisses the hem of her dress, or she has a cloth over her face. I can't really tell, but yeah, he is devastated. He can't really bear it, and he leaves that room and goes back to his own. And a maid comes in, really upset, and says, "Somebody's playing tricks on me." The rabbit sculpture, somebody stole it and replaced it with a real rabbit, and now somebody has stolen the goldfish sculptures and replaced them with real goldfish. So he goes into the room where he's kept these sculptures that they made so long ago, and he goes to the lily, and he picks up the lily, and it's no longer a sculpture of the lily, it is the actual lily itself, and it's very pungent, filling the room with beautiful perfume, and he realizes exactly what is happening, and he runs to the marble room and throws open the doors, and just in time to see Genevieve opening her eyes, coming back to life. So whatever chemical process Boris had discovered only lasted a certain amount of years. This is an absolutely beautiful story. I really do love it. It's actually one of my favorites. I like the science fiction aspect of this chemical, the fact that Boris is a sculptor and a chemist and comes up with this way to dip things in this liquid and make them into stone is incredible. The only real negative I can say to this one, and I don't hopefully this won't start huge fights in the comments, but you never know. Before I say this, you have to understand I absolutely love this book. I enjoyed this book very much, and this is the only story of the 4 that are connected to the King in Yellow that seemed to me to be a very vague connection. And what I mean by that is, if you take the Repairer of Reputations, the one we've already talked about it, and if you remove the King in Yellow from that story couldn't exist. It would fall apart. That story revolves around the King in Yellow. If you were to do the same with this, if you were to take out the King in Yellow from this story would be fine. I honestly feel like, and I have no evidence to back this up, so this is just my opinion, I honestly feel like this story was already written, and he came up with the King in Yellow idea and realized that he could add this to the stories by very easily just adding a couple of sections about the King in Yellow, which is, I feel, exactly what he did. And I'm not even sure the character read the King in Yellow. It's a very vague passage, and I do know that he understands aspect of and remembers aspects of the plays later, so he must have read it. But this convolutes slightly what I think Chambers was trying to do, in the sense that if this is supposed to be a happy ending, which a lot of well, actually they go kind of back and forth. Chambers romances are sometimes happy endings, sometimes not. But this isn't the story of the King in Yellow affecting people's lives. Like, Genevieve and Boris don't even talk about the King in Yellow. I don't even think they read the King in Yellow at any given moment. So this is just about, if he read the King in Yellow, then all these events with the chemical and her turning into a statue and all that have nothing to do with the King in Yellow. And the story ends before the King in Yellow does whatever it's going to do to Alec for having read it. He's Alec at the beginning and he's Alec at the end. And at the end, he doesn't seem to have lost any sanity. He runs into the room, the same Alec that we started with, although, of course, he's made an emotional journey through understanding his love for Genevieve and all that. The King in Yellow does not seem to be a massive aspect of this story. And this story is absolutely awesome with or without it. The only addition the King in Yellow gives the story is we have to assume that afterwards Alec and Genevieve aren't going to get a happy ending, even though the story gave us a happy ending. Alec and Genevieve, Alec is eventually going to go insane because he read the King in Yellow, and who knows what will happen to Genevieve. So in a weird sense, it slightly complicates the story a little more. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this story? It's in my opinion, this is tied with the Repairer of Reputations as my favorite from this from the King in Yellow section of this book. I can't decide which one I like more. I did read all of them, and I think I've said this in the last video, but I'll just say it again. I'm going to cover the King in Yellow stories, and then I'm going to cover the other horror stories in this collection, but I'm not going to cover the last 3 romances that don't have any horror. So yeah, I think the King in Yellow aspect of this story is kind of convoluted in this one. It didn't, and the other 3, all of them absolutely must have the King in Yellow in order for the stories to work. This one was the odd story out, and I think it's a wonderful story either way. Anyway, there you go. That is my thoughts on The Mask. Really wonderful story from the King in Yellow. And for the next video, we will be moving on to In the Court of the Dragon. Funny story. I don't know why. Either somebody, whatever kid or person that had this before me way back in the 50s when this was released, or is this the 60s? I can't remember. Either really liked this story, so they circled the page number they started on, or they really liked the number 69 and circled that. I don't know what's going on there. But that will be the next story that we're going to read, In the Court of the Dragon. So you can expect that tomorrow. All right, thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, please click like. If you like this kind of content, please click subscribe, because we'll be making a lot more of it in the future. Thank you for watching.